Hi everyone. Today I would like to talk about Brexit. However, I do not want to relitigate the entire referendum campaign, nor do I plan to discuss the details of how the United Kingdom is currently exiting the European Union with all the grace of a drunk falling off of a deck chair. Instead, I would like to talk about one specific aspect of Brexit: the impact of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments on the UK's decision to leave the EU, and how the vote to leave has further exacerbated those same xenophobic prejudices. First of all, a disclaimer. I am not saying that every single person who voted for Brexit is a howling racist. What I am saying is that support for Brexit was clearly driven in large part by attitudes towards race and immigration, and that Brexit is thus an inherently racist endeavour. You don't have to be openly racist to have supported Brexit, but you do need to have been willing to co-sign a movement driven by racist sentiments. I've made some pretty bold claims in these opening sentences, so let me back up a bit. I'll start with a question. How important was immigration for Leave voters? I would like to start by turning to polling conducted by Ipsos Mori, a UK polling company. I think it's Mori, I'm never quite sure. Might be Mori. Every month, Ipsos Mori publishes their Issues Index, a survey which aims to discover what the people of the UK think are the biggest issues facing the country. One of the questions asked in the survey is as follows. What do you see as the most important issue facing Britain today? The chart on the screen shows the responses to this question for every month since 2010, when the Conservatives came to power in the UK in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. There are two lines I would like to draw your attention to on this chart. The first is the grey line, which shows the percentage of people who viewed immigration as the most important issue facing Britain. This steadily rose from 2012 onwards, peaking around August 2015, which was just after the general election in which David Cameron retained power following his promise to hold a referendum on EU membership. At this point in time, roughly 40% of the British public viewed immigration as the biggest issue facing the UK, while none viewed EU membership, the green line, as the biggest issue. However, in the run-up to the referendum in June 2016, these two lines start to converge, before EU membership overtakes immigration as the biggest issue for the UK public, just as the public voted on whether to remain in the EU or whether to leave. Ever since the referendum, these lines have continued to diverge, with over 50% of people now saying that EU membership is the biggest issue, and only around 10% thinking immigration is the biggest issue. Why is this significant? I would argue that what this shows is that people for whom EU membership was the biggest issue at the time of the referendum and afterwards were those who had previously said that immigration was the biggest issue. This is supported by the fact that the lines for the NHS, unemployment, and the economy all remained broadly flat over the course of the campaign, suggesting that the people who thought those were the biggest issues did not change their minds. You may, understandably, think this is all a bit contrived. So now I want to look at this question from the other angle. What reason did people give for voting Leave? In a study released in April 2018, the Centre for Social Investigation analysed the results of 3 studies which have all sought to answer this question, and in addition carried out another survey of their own. I've linked the full report below, and I've done the same for all the other sources in this video. But to quote from the summary, the 2 main reasons people voted Leave were immigration and sovereignty. In their survey, roughly 40% of respondents who voted Leave said that immigration was their main reason for leaving, out of the 4 options given, with another 30% saying that it was their second biggest reason for voting Leave. This is broadly consistent with results from other studies they analysed, which were carried out by YouGov, Lord Ashcroft, and the British Election Study Team. In addition to what the data says, the tactics of those who campaigned for Leave clearly demonstrated that they believe immigration to be a key issue for their voters. You may have seen this poster before. This type of image of hordes of immigrants pouring into the UK was relied on heavily by Brexiters. This poster was produced in part to fuel one of the Leave campaign's biggest lies, that Turkey was about to join the EU, that the UK could do nothing to stop this, and that millions of Turkish immigrants would soon come to the UK. This was an outright lie, pure and simple. Turkey was not, and is not, on the verge of joining the EU. Even if it was, as a member of the EU, the UK has a veto on any potential new member joining. There was no truth to this scare story whatsoever, but that did not stop it from taking hold in the public consciousness. The plural of anecdote is not data, but I have spoken to multiple people who cited Turkey when explaining why they voted to leave. And this sort of scaremongering about immigration was a key plank of the Leave campaign. For example, the Vote Leave website describes the EU immigration system as immoral and unfair, and says that the only way to take back control is to vote leave. Looking at all of this, it's pretty clear that immigration was the key issue driving the vote of many Brexit supporters. But some might argue that voting to reduce immigration is not racist, and instead reflects genuine economic concerns. So, let's have a look at this issue. Does immigration harm the UK? Let's start by establishing some basic facts. How many people immigrate to the UK each year? The chart on screen is from the Office for National Statistics, the organisation responsible for collecting and publishing statistics covering all areas of life in the UK. It shows the level of net migration, i.e. the number of immigrants to the UK minus the number of emigrants from the UK, split by citizenship type, for every year since 2008. The first thing that catches the eye is this. EU immigrants do not make up the majority of net migration to the UK. Even when EU immigration to the UK started to rise in 2013, the net migration of EU citizens to the UK never exceeded net migration by non-EU citizens. That is quite important, because leaving the EU does not in any way affect the UK's ability to control immigration by non-EU citizens. The UK already has the power to control this however it wants. The only component of immigration which would be affected by Brexit is immigration by EU citizens. Given that many Leave voters expressed their opposition to immigration to the UK from Asia or Africa or the Middle East, this seems like a fairly big hole in their logic. The lesson to take from this chart is clear. The level of immigration to the UK has historically not been dictated by the UK's membership of the EU. Instead, immigration to the UK has been driven by non-EU immigrants who have come to the UK because policymakers have decided that such immigration is beneficial. But maybe these policymakers are wrong. Maybe immigration has harmed the UK. Has it? To answer this question, there are three important areas to consider. 1. What is the impact of immigration on economic growth been? 2. What has the impact of immigration on public finances been? And 3. What has the impact of immigration on wages and unemployment been? I'm going to rely primarily on 3 papers which look specifically at the effects of immigration on the UK. 2 of them, one from the Oxford University-based Migration Observatory, and one courtesy of VoxEU, which I should add is not related to the website Vox in any way, are meta-analyses of the results of several other studies. The third, from University College London, is the most detailed paper I've seen on the effects of immigration on the UK government finances. The links to all 3 are in the description. There has been other research, and I encourage you to investigate the topic for yourself. I've chosen these 3 papers because between them they are representative of the overall consensus on the effects of immigration. Firstly, economic growth. Here, the evidence is clear. Immigration to the UK has been beneficial for economic growth. As per the paper from Vox EU, Boubtain et al., and I've probably really badly mispronounced that, so apologies, found that for the UK, the estimated impact is that a 1 percentage point increase in the migrant share of the working age population leads to a 0.4 to 0.5% increase in productivity. Jamote et al., again probably mispronounced, found that a 1% increase in the migrant share of the adult population results in an increase in GDP per capita and productivity of approximately 2%. The Vox EU paper concludes that the evidence, while not comprehensive, does suggest that migration to the UK is likely to have boosted productivity and per capita GDP, i.e. GDP per head, not just total GDP. So, immigrants to the UK contribute positively to economic growth, and as we are about to see, immigration is beneficial for the public finances too. The UCL paper, The Fiscal Effects of Immigration to the UK, concludes that between 2001 and 2011, recent immigrants from the A10 countries, the Eastern and Central European countries that joined the EU since 2004, contributed to the fiscal system about 12% more than they took out, with a net fiscal contribution of £5 billion. At the same time, the net fiscal contributions of recent European immigrants from the rest of the EU totalled £15 billion, with fiscal payments about 64% higher than transfers received. Immigrants from outside the EU made a net fiscal contribution of about £5.2 billion, thus paying into the system about 3% more than they took out. In contrast, over the same period, natives to the UK made an overall negative fiscal contribution of £616.5 billion. The net fiscal balance of overall immigration to the UK between 2001 and 2011 therefore amounts to a positive net contribution of about £25 billion over a period where the UK has run a massive budget deficit. In other words, immigrants to the UK contribute more to the government finances than is spent on them, regardless of the origin of those immigrants. So immigration is not just good for the economy as a whole, it is good for the public finances, contrary to the often peddled stereotype of immigrants sponging off benefits. And this conclusion is borne out by the Vox EU paper too. The paper cites studies which find that higher immigration are not associated at a local level with longer NHS waiting times, Giantella et al., and in schools, increased numbers of pupils with English as a second language doesn't have any negative impact on levels of achievement for native English-speaking students, Gay et al., probably mispronounced again. If anything, pupils in schools with lots of non-native speakers do slightly better. The Vox EU paper does acknowledge that there may be specific cases where migration may lead to pressure on public services, such as shortage of primary school places in some areas of London. However, given the large positive fiscal contribution of immigrants to the public finances, it would be more accurate to say that these pressures are the result of the government failing to spend the gains from immigration in the right place, rather than a negative consequence of immigration. Now we come to perhaps the most contentious of the three issues. Does migration negatively impact on wages and employment for native citizens? On this, the message is clear. In aggregate, immigration has no or very little effect on employment and wages. The effect may be slightly larger for those on the lowest incomes, but even in this case, the effect is small and could thus be offset by government spending using the financial gains provided by immigration. To quote the Vox EU paper again, studies have generally failed to find any specific association between migration flows and changes in employment or unemployment for natives, See, for example, BIS 2014 for a review. Nor is there any evidence that immigration has impacted the employment prospects of specific groups, such as the young or unskilled. Turning to wages, while the evidence on wage impacts is less conclusive, the emerging consensus is that recent migration has had little or no impact overall, but possibly some small negative impact on low-skilled workers. It goes on to cite a paper by Nickel and Salahin, which found that a 10 percentage point rise in the immigrant share, that is larger than that observed over the entirety of the last decade, leads to approximately a 1.5% reduction in wages for native workers in the semi or unskilled service sector. That would mean that immigration since 2004 would have reduced wages for native workers in that sector by about 1%, or put another way, would have depressed annual pay increases by about a penny an hour. Impacts in other sectors are even smaller. The conclusion is that while migration may have had some small negative impact on wages for the low paid, other factors, both positive and negative, such as technological change, policies on tax credits and the national minimum wage, were far more important. The Migration Observatory paper finds largely similar results. After reviewing the results of 12 studies, it finds that immigration has little or no impact on average employment or unemployment of existing workers. Immigration, in addition, has had little impact on average wages. Some studies, e.g. Nickel and Salahin, as mentioned earlier, have found a small negative impact on average wages, while others, such as Dustman et al., found positive average effects. The Migration Observatory paper, referencing the same studies as the Vox EU paper, argues that there may be a negative effect on wages for lower skilled workers, but that this is again small. It also notes that research suggests that any adverse wage effects of immigration are likely to be greatest for resident workers who are themselves migrants. This is because the skills of new migrants are likely to be closer substitutes for the skills of migrants already employed in the UK than for those of UK-born workers. In other words, the people whose wages are most likely to be impacted by immigration are other immigrants. So, the evidence suggests that in aggregate, immigration to the UK has had no or very little effect on wages and employment. While immigration may have had a small effect on lower skilled workers, the size of this effect is very, very small, and is dwarfed by the size of the effects of UK government policy. So bringing the three questions we asked together, the conclusions are clear. Immigration to the UK has been good for the economy, it has been good for government finances, and it has had very little effect on wages and employment. To the extent that there have been any impact on wages, this impact has been heavily outweighed by the benefits of immigration, and so sensible government policy could easily have redistributed the benefits to ensure that no one was negatively impacted by immigration. To return back to the original question of Brexit, which we did deviate from quite a long time ago, we saw in part 1 that immigration was key to Leave winning the EU referendum. We have now seen that there is no evidence that immigration has caused major harm to this country. Instead, many people have blamed immigration for issues which are actually the result of the British government's ideologically driven austerity programme. Given that there is no rational economic argument against immigration, by necessity something else must be driving opposition to immigration in the UK. It's very clear what this mystery factor is, and it's not a mystery at all. It is the obvious answer. It is the answer which we've been putting forward for many, many years. Opposition to immigration is fueled above all else by xenophobia and racism. And since opposition to immigration drove the vote to leave the EU, we can lay much of the responsibility for Brexit at the door of prejudice against immigrants. These may seem like bold claims, like a leap of faith, but the evidence for it is clear if we look at what happened after the referendum. I want to start by looking at data published by the UK Home Office on the number of racially or religiously aggravated offences recorded by police on a monthly basis. The chart on screen shows these numbers between April 2013 and March 2018. First of all, I want to draw your attention to the spike in racially and religiously motivated offences around and shortly after the referendum. Prior to the Brexit referendum campaign, the monthly average number of hate crimes in this category was slightly over 3,000. This rose during the campaign and peaked in July 2016, the month after the UK voted to leave the EU, at roughly 5,500 offences in that month. It is not a stretch to argue the obvious implication that the Brexit referendum and the Leave campaign's anti-immigrant rhetoric fueled xenophobic views and contributed directly to a surge in racial and religious hate crimes. The second point is subtler, but I would argue even more important. Even if you ignore the spike in hate crimes in mid-2017, which occurred following a series of terrorist attacks, the level of racial and religious hate crimes post-EU referendum is clearly higher than before. This is further evidence for the core contention that pro-Brexit campaigners' use of racist and anti-immigrant rhetoric has exacerbated xenophobia and prejudice within the UK. And it's not just me picking up on this and arguing this. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland said in her end of mission statement that the discourses on racial equality before, during and after the 2016 referendum, as well as the policies and practices upon which the Brexit debate has conferred legitimacy, raise serious issues at the core of my mandate. Many with whom I consulted highlighted the growth in volume and acceptability of xenophobic discourses on migration and on foreign nationals, including refugees, in social and print media. In the days following the EU referendum, the government reported a spike in the number of hate crimes in England and Wales. But what do we do about this? Well, the Special Rapporteur had some recommendations on that front too. In her statement, she recommends that the UK adopt immigration policies in advance of and following its exit from the EU that shield EU and non-EU migrants from the threat of racial and ethnic discrimination. Unfortunately, the government has done the complete opposite. Over the last 9 years, the Conservative Party has consistently based its immigration policy on appealing to racism rather than on the facts. When she was Home Secretary, Theresa May was the architect of the racist hostile environment policy, which was responsible for the illegal deportation of members of the Windrush generation and the infamous Go Home vans, which were sent to neighbourhoods with large immigrant populations in an attempt to scare people into leaving the UK. The government's immigration bill has been rightly condemned for pandering to the far right to the detriment of the UK economy. As just one example, the bill would restrict immigration to those earning more than £30,000 a year, which would, among other things, effectively halt the UK's ability to bring in nurses from abroad. Given that the NHS already suffers from chronic staff shortages and is highly dependent on immigrants to continue to function, this policy would be highly damaging to public services for no reason other than to appeal to xenophobic sentiments. Before I finish this video, I want to quickly review the evidence. In part 1, we saw how immigration was one of the key drivers behind the UK's decision to leave the EU. In part 2, we saw how immigration has benefited the UK economy and how this makes it very difficult to argue that opposition to immigration is grounded in anything other than racism and xenophobia. In part 3, we saw how the Brexit campaign and scaremongering about immigration have injected further venom into the veins of society and how the UK government is actively enabling hatred via its immigration policy. I wish I had easy answers as to how we deal with this. Unfortunately, when hatred and prejudice are so deeply ingrained in society, there are no easy solutions. I do have a few suggestions. 1. Oppose Brexit. Leaving the EU because of xenophobia, led by a government with a long history of enacting racist policy, will only pour fuel on the fire. 2. Fight myths about immigration. When someone is talking bollocks about immigrants or spreading lies about immigrants, be prepared to call them out on it. 3. Campaign for evidence-based immigration policy. All the evidence tells us that immigration is a good thing for the UK. We should be opening our borders, not closing them. We need immigration policy based upon both facts and empathy, not policy built upon lies and hatred. The current state of political discourse on immigration, both in the UK and internationally, is toxic, depressing, and dangerous. We cannot and we must not give in to demagogues who preach hate. We must fight for a fairer society, and we must stand up for immigrants and for their rights. Thank you for watching.